American national government. This is Dr. Patrick Stewart. Chapter 8, The Mass Media in Politics. In this segment, we'll be considering the learning objective of understanding and appreciating the role and limitations of the press in the public sphere. So, what is the role of the press in the public sphere? One of the things that is promised by the press is its role in disseminating information to the public about government. And see, the role of the press is to promote the core democratic value of political freedom. The idea that we have a public sphere, a forum where information can be freely accessed and exchanged, and the media is a media to exchange these ideas. And as we discussed earlier, a free marketplace of perspectives and ideas are critically important to a healthy democracy. The evolution and response to a continually changing environment relies upon new ideas which can only come about from the recombining and criticizing of ideas that already are in the environment. Furthermore, the flow of information that comes through the media serves as an important check on government and its public policies and whether or not they are accomplishing what they state they are accomplishing. So let's take a look at the informing and educating role that's played by the news media. Well, the one thing that we do know is that while the news media sees this as their primary role, the public is not passive in the process of being informed and educated. Instead of the media being biased, perhaps it is best to consider individuals being biased because individuals filter information through their pre-held perspectives and biases. And here, the psychological concepts of confirmation and disconfirmation biases become very important. Indeed, most people readily accept information confirming their views, but find fault with information conflicting with their own views. In other words, it is really hard for all of us to accept information that states that we're wrong, but we're more than happy to accept information that states that we are correct with our assumptions. Now, the research out there, especially the brain scan-based research, suggests that what drives how we process information is the emotional part of our brain, not the reasoning part. So despite the fact that we consider ourselves rational actors, we're actually very much emotional actors. What we see here with the research that's discussed in the text is that when individuals are shown pictures of disliked political candidates, what happens is a negative emotional response. These negative emotional responses suppress more rational processing, and as a result, there is more of a tendency to find problems with these individuals. So let's take a look at the importance of media's information and education role. Now, ever since the rise of the direct primary, in which case individuals were able to vote within their party or in open primaries on the presidential candidates, the power of nominating candidates is in the hands of the public, and hence the informational role that is provided by the media has played much more of an important role. Now, this is certainly due to more information being out there, but also there are more citizens that play a role in who becomes a candidate. Furthermore, because as humans we have a negativity bias, and because negative news drives the media and their sales, there's more negativity when it comes to politics. Now, one of the things to consider is that the different sorts of media influences the processing of information because there's different types of information. So even though television, newspapers, and talk radio might present the same sorts of information, it provides it in different packets. For instance, when we watch TV, it's passive. This information is easy to access. It just flows to us. But there's tight limits on the amount and depth of information that may be provided, especially when you consider that during network news, stories that are long last 1 minute. And furthermore, the news media is dominated by for-profit networks. So while there might be a bias there, the bias will be to sell the news. And that's certainly something we'll talk about in later segments. Now, newspapers, and to a great extent the internet, requires literacy. The stories jump from page to page, so you have to follow the entire story. And you might take time from 5 minutes to 7 minutes to 12 minutes to read a story. So it's certainly more information that's processed, but also processed in a different manner than in television, because this information is processed more cognitively. And as a result, the Americans who rely on newspapers tend to be better informed and more knowledgeable about politics than those who rely on television alone. Now, finally, talk media is a medium where the heavy consumers tend to be more misinformed, yet they have more confidence in their viewpoints than those who are more informed. And this is likely due to the fact that they're not processing as much different viewpoints that might be the case with newspapers, or certainly the internet, or even television. Although, as we found with the recent elections, that people do live in bubbles when it comes to their politics and their processing of information. So, as we've seen trends here since the turn of the century, that television, while it has diminished to a certain extent, still accounts for a substantial proportion of the source of national and international news for the general public. At the same time, we see that the internet has increased while the newspapers have continued on its downward trend, and radio, while trending downward somewhat, has remained rather steady. Now, when we consider campaign news sources with the last time that this information was taken, which is 2010, which is, of course, a few years back, we see that television accounts for the greatest proportion of informational news sources, followed by the newspaper, the internet, the radio, and, to a much lesser extent, magazines. Now, the interesting thing is that if we want to get our best information, oftentimes is in the unmediated form. In other words, the press conferences, the debates, the speeches, and so on and so forth, because this allows us to hear directly from the newsmakers themselves. However, the time invested in this can be quite a lot, and there's an awful lot of processing that must go on. And of course, each of those politicians will have their own message that they'll put forward. So, when we consider the role of media, the press has traditionally embraced this role of government watchdog. In other words, they monitor the government officials and their actions for signs of corruption and deceit. Now, this is not just due to the fact that this is a part of the decency of their heart and support for the democracy, but also it sells newspapers when they're able to uncover such activities. Likewise, the press has taken on the role of public advocate and representative because it has a unique access to ask questions and probe officials on behalf of the public interest. In other words, the First Amendment provides them with substantial ability to ask the questions that are the difficult questions. However, the question is, has the press lived up to its role as a watchdog in recent years? Now, to a certain extent, it can be considered the truth that they have done so, but there are still questions as to whether they are watching enough of what's going on or if there are still problems out there with this. This will be something that we will address in future segments. American national government.